Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everybody. This session is labeled the second session, but of course, for all of us, this is the first session. So, we have three scholars from South Europe, and they will talk. They want to talk about rather different themes, but as far what I have seen, they are very interesting, and I'm also curious to hear, because before I haven't seen the papers either, so I'm as curious as you are. First, my name is Jan Hoffenaar. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm head of research at the Netherlands Institute of Military History, and I'm also in the board of the ICMH. I'm the man of the finances. First, I want to introduce from Italy. You may come, you can also walk over there. Enrico Magnani. Mr. Magnani is, as some of you already know, currently a United Nations officer, and he is also a researcher specialized in political and military affairs, and he has got a PhD in international relations, discussing the work of UN observers during the Greek Civil War. And he is also a member of the Academic Council of the UN system. And his main field of interest is peacekeeping, stability operations, and post-war occupation regimes. Today, Mr. Magnani would like to present a paper focused on the role of great powers in the attempt to dismantle Turkey and Russia after World War I. Enrico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be back in the Environment International Commission on Military History after 2 years of absence due for external reasons. And I would like also to add a couple of words. Given my position as of UN servant, what I'm going to say is just my personal opinion that do not necessarily involve the position of my organization. According to the program, the name of my presentation is a little bit different from what I presented as proposal, because during the work I concentrated and focused more on this kind of issue. That to me remained one of the key points that could explain the political-military action of the great alliance, the great powers, Western great powers, in this part of the world that remain also my long time ago personal interest since I was a young student in the university. So the final phase of the World War I was especially bitter and cruel, not only on the hardness of the fight between exhausted warring parties, with the exception of the United States, of course, but also because it made clear that the alliance against the Central Power was a mere facade. The Allied growing division emerged with a peculiar form toward the one enemy, the Ottoman Empire, and a former ally, Russia. And in this light, the year of 1918 could be considered not only the year of the end of the war, but also the beginning of a new era, marked by new dynamics as well, with the attempt to reaffirm all might. Their approach could be labeled as the reproposition of old playbooks, which dominated the policies, especially from Great Britain and France, since the 19th century, toward these two entities. To them, with a minor extent and with different motivation, could be added Italy, United States, Japan, Serbia, with Croatia and Slovenia at the moment, Greece, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Poland.
Enrico, sorry, is it on purpose that the keeps
purpose.
concern?
Just to keep away your attention to what I said.
Okay.
Altogether, the mask, behind the mask of a cohesive policy, the main target for them was the demolition and partition among the winners of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the weakened Russia, and where this was not possible, replicating for Moscow the planned fate for Ottomans with the establishment of a galaxy of puppet states. The strategic target of Paris and London was multiple: extend their area of influence, directly or indirectly, pushing back any threat against their own national strategic interest, and standing in front to their allies, especially if minor, like the case of the growing polarization between France and Italy. In this gigantic plan, the personalities of Lloyd George, Churchill, and Clemenceau emerged as dominant, and maybe never like before, the political use of armed force was really central. Even I should add that the level of the Allied force deployed in these two mentioned areas, even at least for the Western standard, were limited in comparison with the millions of men deployed in the different fronts of World War I. But they remained highly influential and played a decisive political role, but with a very small, even not at all, combat role. Now I start a chapter that I named After the Garden of Salonika. The fighting among the Macedonian front in September 1918 were much less known about to the others of the Western Front, like the Somme and Vittorio Veneto, Verdun, Ypres. But in terms of delivering to the major blow to the Central Power, continue to consider it remain the decisive one. However, controversy had marked the life of the Allied Armée d'Orient, ever since it began deploying 3 years early through Salonika, the Greek port city that provided southern gateway to the Balkans, after the French-British disastrous attempt to take by force the Straits of Dardanelles. The force, 600,000 altogether, formally under French command, included French, British, Serbian, Italian, Montenegro, Russian contingent, added later with Greeks and pro-Entente Albanian units. The management of this army persistently reflected the divergent objective of the participants, like the British contingent tried always to reduce the minimum the impact of the French leadership and directives. Also among the French-Italian contingent, the relations were at least controversial. And the collapse of the Central Power following the attack in September 1918 underlined the divergent lines of the Allied, not only political, but also military speaking terms. The British troops were launched in to secure the Turkish Straits, the Italians in to protect Albania, and French in their staunch support of Serbia, with the aim to set up a South Pan-Slavic state in the Western Balkans under the influence of Paris. After the visit of Talat Pasha, the Grand Vizier, to other Central Power capitals in September 1918, Constantinople realized that there were no hopes to win the war. Few days after, this government resigned, and the new one was appointed. 2 days after the designation, the Ottoman authorities sent the captured general Charles Fers Townshend to the Allies to seek the terms of an armistice. London interpreted this move as Britain could lead alone, on behalf of the Allied, the negotiation. As of today, the motives of it are not entirely clear. if it was a sincere wish of interpretation of the Britain or to keep out the French. The negotiation began on 27 October on board of HMS Agamemnon. And the British refused the participation of French military delegation to the talks. And this led another rift between French and British political leadership. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, the Tigre, complained about the British unilateral decision. Lloyd George countered that the French had the same approach in signing the Armistice of Salonika, done without consultation and without enough time for the other contingent, commanding contingent, to deal with their own government to have a contribution for that. And while Great Britain, in their answer, said that London, together with Moscow, had committed most troops, large number of troops, in the campaign against the Ottoman Empire, counting Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Caucasus. Anyway, as part of the armistice condition, the main thing was the Ottoman troops has to surrender wherever they can, and leaving to the Allies to occupy the forts controlling the Strait of Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, as well many parts of the Ottoman territory in case of disorder. This clause was largely and very freely interpreted by the Allied, that used it in many cases to interfere with the Turkish policy. The Ottoman forces were demobilized, and all the ports, railways, and strategic points were made available for the Allied use. Nevertheless, in order to finalize the asset and the partition scheme, it required 15 months of tough negotiation between the Allies, mainly between France, Britain, and Italy, and progressively enter a new actor in this thing, that was Greece. That, thanks to the strong action of the Prime Minister Venizelos, was able to take an important role in this scenario. The army, the Turkish army was restricted to 50,000 troops, the navy to few old ships, and no air force. And like to the other Central Powers countries, an inter-allied commission of control that supervised the execution of the military clause was established. In the general point of view, the Treaty of Sèvres could be read like a simple variation of a long-planned design to dismantle an enemy power, and in that case, implemented with an important variation, as I mentioned above, the inclusion of Greece. The policies already designed since the London Pact, the Saint-Jean de Maurienne, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and also, let me add, the Tittoni-Venizelos Agreement, a post facto sub-agreement in the sideline of the Peace Conference of Versailles. It's my personal opinion, this treaty and together the other one, Sèvres and the other one, show the worst face on the imperialistic dreams of the winner powers. Not only with above mentioned military clause, but also with the establishment of zone of influence. Within the territory, as in one of the maps shows, the territory of at least the Asian territory and the European one was split between the winners. But the winners were not in a good terms among them. At the contrary, that created further hostility and weakened the political action of the Allied, together with the ethical credibility they try always to show around the international, if I could say, existing at that time, public opinion. Italy was confirming the possession of the Deccanese and a large portion of Anatolia, where Italy, according to the treaty, the terms of the Treaty of Pact of London, wishes to setting up an Italian colony, named Laelicia. The Italian troops start to land in Antalya in March 1919, but their number was almost limited to facing a so large challenge. According to the figures, no more than 13,000 troops, plus small contingent in Constantinople and Konya. But the presence of the Italian troops started to enter quite soon in friction with the expanding range of action of the Greek troops that from the enclave of Smyrna start to enter and taking the control of Western Anatolia. Among them, also want to mention one word about France. France want to extend further from Syria and Lebanon to take a large part of control of southern Turkey, while Great Britain did not establish any zone of influence, but simply because they don't need that. They have already enough. The key of their action, of the geographical target of the British, was to have in the control of Mesopotamia and the oil reserves. Moving from Kuwait, that was already a British territory, they want expanded in Western Asia. The territory occupied by the Allied forces more or less followed the same scheme that we saw in Germany, and mainly in Germany, in Rhineland, with partition of areas of occupation. Symbolic was the control of Constantinople, the capital, that despite a clearly understandable request of Greece, remained out of the Greek control. Even there was a Greek contingent in the city. But at the end of the day, the control of urban area of Constantinople was a business substantially limited to British and France. Italy and Greece in Constantinople remained a little bit marginal. And the management of the occupation of the city was always marked by a very strong political fight between French and British in the management of the city and the political lines of this occupation. In order to formalize the presence of the Allied forces in Constantinople, that was really symbolic, was established a Corps d'Occupation de Constantinople on the 6th of November 1920. As you see, while the Allied troops arrived in the Ottoman capital, in the then Ottoman capital, few days after the ceasefire in October 1918, only 2 years after was possible to formalize this statute, showing that even a military occupation had behind strong political disagreement. The growing splits between the allies is widely attributed to the fact that the partition of Turkey had given to France a too small share. The Italians, too, were dismayed by the concession made by London to Athens at Rome's expense. This discontent gave rise to Franco-Italian support to the Turkish nationalist movement, and they abandoned the cohesion of the alliance. And France and Italy worked against Greece. In the regional perspective, because I focus mainly on France and Britain in this small paper, France had strong grievance against Britain, where, at the contrary to prior agreement, the latter did not want to share Mosul area oil exploitation, and according to Paris, steered Emir Faisal, the leader of so-called Arab revolt that was reason of books and movies, to attack the French troops in Syria. In other words, France labeled the British approach as selfish, imperialist, while Paris applied the same policies in many other regions, like the Balkans, in the Baltic Sea, Silesia, Poland, against not only the former enemies like Germany, but also the present allied, Italy. The Allied had begun to split already in 1919 because the competing interests in several regions, Syria, Mesopotamia, Cilicia, and Aegean. But the...
Enrico? 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. The functionality of the occupation corps of Constantinople was seriously affected, even in daily life was just busy in occupation duties without major security problem by the Turkish nationalist movement in the area, was affected by the arrival of 150,000 white Russian refugees. The army and civilian who followed the defeat of General Wrangel in Crimea, and the issue of the remnants of the Tsarist Black Sea Navy that end up, majority of the ships in Tunisia under French control. And the other major and final crisis of the occupation corps of Constantinople was due to the defeat of the Greek forces in their expansion into Anatolia. This physically show the rift between the Allied. Only to the approach of the Turkish forces to the Straits, only Britain was ready to take the weapons and push back the Turkish, while France and Italy gave to their contingent garrisoning the area not to intervene in any kind of conflict. At the end, Great Britain remained alone, and the Greek forces were defeated and were obliged to leave the Asian coast, and this led to the final withdrawal of the Allied forces from Turkey in a very gloomy environment. And that was marked by ethnic religious violence between Greek and Turkish, and signed, at least to my view, formally the end of the Allied entente of the World War I. I would like just to spend a few words, if you allow me, just a few words on the Allied intervention in southern Russia, very shortly. The Russian quagmire was even worse at this point of view than the one in Turkey. Because at least there was a kind of series of legal and political treaties between the parties. The only action that led France and Britain and other countries as well to intervene against the Bolshevik Russia was a convention signed the day after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between Bolshevik Russia and Germany and Austria. And again, they established the old-fashioned colonial dreams in influence zone. Britain, of course, with their energy strategic approach, they want to have the control of Caucasus in order to secure the oil hydrocarbons capability of this region, while France wants to establish a zone of influence in southern Russia, also in order to provide a kind of support to another partner of the architecture, of security architecture that France wants to have after World War I with a reinforced Romania. I think I'm finished my time. Thank you very much.
For trying to unravel the very complicated situation in the Near East after World War I. We decided to first to let the speakers present their papers, and after that there will be time for questions and answers. The second speaker for today is Colonel Nuno Lemos de Pires. He is a colonel at the Special Operations branch of the infantry of the Portuguese Army. He is, at the moment, professor at the Portuguese Military Academy, and he participated already in quite a lot of missions in Mozambique, in Angola, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And in the meantime, he also has published a lot of books, 8 books, and more than 100 articles. So I think he is the right man to discuss with us about, and now I will recall the title of his paper, From the Multidimensional World Wars, so from 1914 till 1945, to the multi-domain of the future. I am very curious. Colonel.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to be back in the conferences. Last year in Cameroon, this year here in Israel. And when I have this little bit complicated title, is because I do have an argument. And my argument is more or less like this. During the World Wars, 1940-1945, there was multi-dimensions working at the same time, but there was not an holistic approach to integrate all of them in a concrete strategic view. So, yes, we had land, air, sea, we had hidden dimensions that were working side by side in many occasions from First World War and Second World War, and it evolves, and I will talk about it, but they were not congregated. They were sometimes reactive, sometimes accidental, and the majority of the times they were not aligned. 2017, the United States Army and the United States Marine proposed a new doctrine for the USA called multi-domain battle. And it was now rebaptized, in this summer as multi-domain operations and strategy. And it's all about integrating air, sea, land, space, and cyberspace, adding to 2 dimensions, the electronic dimension and the cognitive domain, in what we call an integrated approach or a holistic approach to use all instruments of power. So my argument is, even if we now seem to learn the lessons from the past, that all the instruments of power and all dimensions should be aligned to win wars, I think we are not there yet. So let me expand a little bit on this idea of looking at multi-dimension and multi-domain. Multi-dimension is what is happening in different layers of political activity. Multi-domain is physical and at the same time not physical, but perine status. Let me go first for what was the World Wars. Yes, there was a multi-dimension. And yes, they were political. And yes, there was a lot of things happening at the same time. We just heard before how, for instance, the First World War in Africa was about operations, but was about politics, was about Arab movements, was about nationalists, was about political Islam, was about a lot of things. But again, they were not aligned with many of the strategies that were thought. And some of the authors that think about First World War and Second World War, sometimes they say that, for instance, Second World War was a war of improvising. Improvising, why? Because it was reactive. So when you see Paul-Émile von Lettow-Vorbeck, his initiative in Africa and what is now called Tanzania, when he had in First World War all of his initiatives, what the global powers did at that time was to react, because there was not foreseen the future at that time that a man would have this initiative that led to a different front. So when we go a little bit deeper and we look about the changes and the dimensions we have in this World War, we can go for strict trenches of the First World War, or you have the speed of movement of blitzkrieg, and all of these gives us the idea of another dimension that is always present, probably one of the main ones, and sometimes a little bit neglected, it's the industrial. Talking about millions of soldiers, airmen, talking about millions of equipment and ships and navies, and all of these had to be congruent with operations and, of course, political determination. So this is what we see. But there are also hidden dimensions that they were always present. All of these wars had media effect, because First World War and especially Second World War, everybody around the world could know what was happening, because we have instant news. There was not internet at that time, but we could know what was happening. But we could know what was happening while at the pace that was told. So the truth was told by a certain way, and many of the media and many of the news that we knew was about, it's more propaganda than news. That's why I mix a little bit propaganda with the idea of media and thinking. But the cognitive domain influenced the mind of people, getting them to be determined to the will of the instruments of power, to be aligned, to win wars. They were present. Were they, in a holistic view, congregated and aligned? I still say no, they were not, but they were there. And was there a dimension about pre-conflict conditions, during the wars and post-conflict conditions, meaning, did Germany think about invading Poland, and then what are we going to do in the next 10, 20 years? What are we going to do with some of the territories that are going to be annexed for the next 10 or 15 years? Was that thought in 1939? So many of the now we call it nation building, we call it about long-term strategies. That's analogies from things that we say today in 2018, but that was not a verbal, that was not words that we see in the texts from 1945, for instance. So there was a lot of other hidden dimensions, for instance, espionage, sabotage, subversion, all that was working secretive, and at the same time, there was a dimension of values. And sometimes we don't really, but I think we are in the right place to talk about here in Israel. When we talk about when people think and feel the atrocities of certain gestures that really change the way we view war. And of course, I didn't put here, but the nuclear weapon that happened in Japan in 1945 changed the character of war, as everybody knows. So all of these dimensions, they are there. So let me give an example of my country. My country changed dramatically from First World War to Second World War. In the First World War, we could say there were a lot of dimensions and they were completely not aligned. I would say it was a political disaster to rule this dimension in Portugal from 1914 to 1918. But it was not the same during the Second World War. So we changed attitudes. In the First World War, we needed belligerence. We needed to go into war because there was an internal problem. So you see, the internal dimension forced an external dimension. We needed to go to war because we needed to force a system inside the country. But in the Second World War, we needed not to go. And it was a little bit more easier to get a neutral, collaborative, with allies without being at war at the same time. So when we look about what was happening, there was a completely not matched, completely divorced levels of what the military on the ground in Flanders or in Africa were proposing, and about the decisions coming from Lisbon that were completely unrealistic. But at the same time, in the Second World War, we were much more prudent because we knew that our decisions were not ours. We had to react to the will of the global powers. And for instance, if Germany did do the Plan Isabella or the Phoenix offensive against the Iberian Peninsula, we knew that our allies were ready to invade Mozambique, Angola, East Timor, and other places. The Plan Z, that we know in 48 hours the Union of South Africa would have invaded Mozambique. They were ready. They had already the troops deployed and they were ready to go in. So that meant that we had to have a very prudent planning. So did we learn from one war to the other? Yes, we did. And we tried to evolve that in what I call lessons learned for the futures. Because in First World War, our level of ambition was completely unrealistic. We could send a brigade to fight inside British Expeditionary Force, maybe a division, but no, our politicians wanted a full core level. We had no troops, no money, no industrial, no political stability to do that. But in the Second World War, yes, we did the right approaches with France, with the United States, with England, to make sure that we will cede or we will get the use for their Azores Islands, for instance, to get their planes and the submarine warfare, but at the same time, let's keep it under our own rule. And of course, we had this perspective that, for instance, Japan invaded East Timor, and we wanted to get it back. So we learned that a holistic approach, putting the political dimension over the military dimension, had to be permanent, and that used a lot of these lessons for what we call the colonial wars in 1961, 1974. So yes, we can find some kind of political approach after that. So what is multi-domain concept now? The multi-domain concept developed by the United States in 2018, now I'm talking about multi-domain operations and strategy now, as it is called now today, it's a new political approach because it's not only about land, air, sea, cyberspace, and space, but it's also about interagency, making sure that all instruments of power are aligned to get leverage. Against what? Near-peer competition, so global powers against global powers, but also in hybrid wars and guerrilla warfare. This concept was designed to get that, and does not replace other concepts that are already developing. It's a complementary one. So it's all about giving the right element to be more joint, to create a lot of integrated units. So we're not talking about Marines, we're not talking about Army, Navy, or Air Force, talking about units that are created to be joint permanently, so integrated, less dimension, and less sustainment. What does it mean, less sustainment? Because technological development can allow us to send units without refilling, getting energy from the sun, very light maneuvers, having 3D printers to replace wheels. And all of this is happening now, and it's already in place, as you know. So these 5 dimensions, it's called domains, air, sea, land, cyberspace, and space, with 2+ dimensions, electromagnetic spectrum and cognitive. That's the concept of multi-domain. So I have developed this theory of the holistic command of war 4 years ago that goes a little bit to try to prove in reality, if you do want to win a situation of war, you have to act in 4 different layers. First layer is you have to have command, not control, not coordination, but command over security forces and armed forces. In any country that you go, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, if they are not coordinated, if they are not aligned, if they don't have a C2 system, it will not work. Second, you have to be sure to have, now you cannot have command, because you cannot command civilians, you cannot command NGOs, but you must have unity of effort to make sure that state instruments of power and non-governmental organizations are aligned without what political ambitions need. The third dimension you need to make sure is that from the political levels all down to the tactical level, everything is aligned. Because now we know in 2018 that one soldier makes a difference in the political arena. The way he acts, what he does, and how he feels. So they have to be aligned. And last and not least, there has to be coherence. And I just show this image because we know that policy changed in the United States when George Bush left and Barack Obama came in. It's just evident. But sometimes we think that stops there. It doesn't stop there. The moment the policy changes, the politics change, operational and tactical has to change dramatically. And sometimes we continue fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq like nothing happened. Oh, yes, it did. So what I did was I went a little bit further in the scope of time, and I went to see 3 leaders that were holistic. The Duke of Wellington during the Peninsular War, because he did have control over the civilian and the military component. In the Peninsular War, the Duke of Wellington controlled all the military, regular and irregular, what you call guerrillas. He had the C2 command over all the forces. He had a permanent seat in the government of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where was our king. He had a permanent seat in the Portuguese government in Lisbon. So he could control the civilian activities and the military activities. The second I chose was a Portuguese general leading the war in Guinea from 1968 to 1973, and he was governor and commander-in-chief. He was double-headed. You know, like Richard Templer, for instance, in Malaysia. So he had the ability to influence all the instruments of power at the same time. And the third one was General David Petraeus in Iraq, and then later in Afghanistan. He succeeded very well in Iraq because he was, you can call it a bicephal leadership, because him and the ambassador Ryan Crocker had the civilian power and the military power at the same time. So they could have a strategy of anaconda, and they could develop systems that, in a whole-of-government approach, made the difference in Iraq in 2007, 2008. It did not work in Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan it was very, very much complicated. You had 49 countries, 400 different NGOs, and a lot of capitals to respond to. And the alignment between Ryan Crocker, the ambassador, and David Petraeus, the general, was not the same with Richard Holbrooke, for instance, in Afghanistan and him. So, in the end, what was the trend? The trend of these three holistic leaders, yes, they had a holistic approach. Yes, they had this line, very thin line between political and operational that was working. It was coherent, and they had future plans. If you see the plans of General David Petraeus, he was looking at Afghanistan for 2025. So, in this sense, what is the theory of the holistic command of war? It's 4 dimensions. First, you must ensure that you have command over all military and security forces. The second line is you have to have coordination between civilian and non-military forces. Third, from political level down to the tactical level, it has to be coherence. It has to be aligned. And fourth dimension is you have to have plans before, during, and after conflict, ante, in, and post-conflict. So, when you look about what happened these times is everything that happened inside your home ground, inside your own country, affected what was happening on the front line, and the reverse. And we have this idea that one thing affects the other. And the second thing is when you look now at the multi-domain concept, you have 5 domains in 2 areas, all the hidden dimensions are there as well. So, as conclusion, when we finish the First World War, and we are going to the Second World War, what was not finished? All the dimensions, they were not aligned. So when we see Versailles, and we just talked about Sèvres and other pacts that was after First World War, there was a lot of resentment. And the resentment, the Germans and the resentment about, we can find it, you know, today. If you look a little bit careful, still Russia has unsolved issues from the end of the Cold War. Still, China doesn't feel respected as they should be in the world of powers today, or countries like Brazil or India. And all of those unsolved issues led to another phrase I have there, is called capacity building. From 1934, 1936 afterwards, these countries that had resentments, I'm just calling resentments, they were building capacity. They were building strong navies, strong armies, strong forces. They were building power. So we don't match the political will with the capacity building, then you can have disruptive factors and the war can jump in. So the cognitive domain, and that's why I put Winston Churchill here, the cognitive domain is always there. Because everything that we have is war of perception. Is it justice? Is it logical? Is it aligned? Is it in the way that people think behind, think about Vietnam, how soldiers on the front line and people back in the USA were supporting the same war. So when you think about all of these, you have to see that this connection is also interconnected, homeland and front line. So is this a revolution, multi-domain concepts? No, I say it's a natural evolution. And now, in 2018, never like before, the soldier. Like Samuel Fuller said this more than 40 years ago, is still the dominant weapon because he's the only one that really can integrate the political need, the feeling, the instrument, to make it sure that we can have a multidimensional approach, a holistic approach to solve conflicts of the future. Thank you so much.
The development of doctrine towards what we nowadays call a joint, integrated, even holistic approach. I have some questions about it. not only critical ones, but we will discuss it later. Thank you very much. Okay. In the meantime, we have another distinguished scholar from Portugal who will present us a paper. João José Brandão Vieira.
Not bad.
Thank you. He's a retired lieutenant colonel from the Portuguese Air Force. He used to be also an airline captain, and he has a master in strategy. And during his career, he was an instructor and a fighter pilot. He was also a squadron commander and airbase second in command. He was defense attaché in Guinea, in a former Portuguese Guinea and Senegal. And on the academic level, he has participated and still is participating in several academies and also institutions. And he has written a lot of books and articles. But today he will speak about the evolution of the concept of self-determination and international law. Colonel.
Good afternoon to all you. Mr. Jan Hoffman, chair of the panel, dear colleagues of the same panel, ladies and gentlemen. It's with a great joy that I'm visiting Israel and participating in this international conference in military history, events that happen in both cases for the first time. In preparing my coming here, I heard a story in which a son says to its father, "Father, is it true that in some countries of the Middle East, men only know their wives after they married?" "No, son," said the father, "that's a lie. It is like that all over the world." Now, since we are under the dictatorship of time, I must address my speech without any other delay. The evolution of international law due to the expansion of the different peoples throughout the world, mainly by sea, that later gave origin to the international maritime law and to the international colonial law, is a poorly studied matter, not well known and full of ideological prejudices, which derived naturally from the interests of the main powers. Portugal being the first country to attempt to discover new ways, lands, and peoples using the open sea, a purpose which had never happened since antiquity, was the one that not only suffered first with the consequences of that evolution, as it was the last one to resist and deal with it until the third quarter of the 20th century. Portugal was, by that matter, one of the main actors in the international arena, which lasted 6 centuries. It was not a minor thing to happen. Portugal was the first European country that went out of its continental borders and the last one to return. Such a fact is due to 3 main reasons. Portugal was the first nation state to be built and is the most perfect one, similarly to Japan, which is an archipelago, and only obtained its unity, let me emphasize this, after the fire weapon have been introduced by the Portuguese in the middle of the 16th century. Its geopolitical situation, which was well described by a Portuguese chronicle from the 14th century, Gomes de Zurara, and he said, "For one side we are surrounded by sea, and for the other we have a wall in the kingdom of Castile." And for the last one was the specific nature of the Portuguese colonization and its relation with other people which have no parallel with any other. The loss of the overseas territories began as far as the 17th century, mainly in the Far East, as a very painful point in 1822 with the independence of Brazil, and ended in 1975, well, so far, here where took place what was called of decolonization. The decolonization was a disaster, and the way it was done was shameful and had catastrophic consequences for Portugal and for the new states that emerged from such a process, and they were Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, St. Thomas and Principe, all in 1975, East Timor in 1999, after being occupied by Indonesia for 24 years, and Macau in 1999, here in which it was incorporated into the Public Republic of China. All of these last facts had their origin in events occurred after the end of World War II. For us to understand all of what happened, we must make an incursion in the Portuguese expansion and retraction, in the field of international law, regarding the use of the sea and colonial domain, and in geopolitical situation in the end of the Second World Conflict. The extraordinary Portuguese expansions in the world began with the conquest of the city of Ceuta in 1415, notwithstanding the first expedition to the Canary Islands had been made in 1340. This expansion reached its peak by the middle of the 16th century, when the Portuguese flag waved in India, Japan, China, and other parts of the Far East, lots of places in Africa, the Atlantic, and South America. Besides the Arctic and the Antarctic, no ocean was unknown to the ships of the Portuguese Navy. In Europe, the connection between the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea was made since the 12th century by different types of Portuguese ships that maintained commercial, diplomatic, and military relations between the different peoples and civilizations. Portugal captured the codfish, as you know, a very traditional national fish, in the Newfoundland since the 15th century. Well, today we buy it all from Norway. I will try to give you an idea of the main milestones of that expansion. As I told you, Ceuta in 1415. And we go like this. I cannot have the time to explain all of that, so you can read it afterwards in the document. The Azores in 1427, I will do some remarks. The Newfoundland was found in 1462. We arrived to Elmina in 1471, and it goes like this. We have Portuguese-Danish expeditions in 1477. We sent some expeditions by land and sea to India and the Kingdom of Prest John after 1487. And Bartolomeu Diaz goes beyond the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. So this, and finally, Vasco da Gama arrived to India in 1498. And Pedro Álvares Cabral discovered officially the Brazil in 1500. And he keeps going through all the 16th century. Until 1510, we conquered Goa in India and Afonso Albuquerque conquered Malacca in the next year. And we arrived China for the first time in 1513. So it's a huge kind of expansion. We conquest Hormuz in 1515. He's already there. And almost for sure, Cristóbal Mendonça reached Australia in 1522. And let's see what else that can be interesting. In 1542, we arrived in Japan. where it is now. Here it is. And we spread afterwards in Macau, 1557. And it's still going. We incorporate the Amazon River in 1616. Every kind of trips by sea and land. And finally, we end up in 1680 with the foundation of the colony of Sacramento, actual Uruguay. So these are the main landmarks of the expansion, but what really has occurred is much, much more of what I just said. For a country with about 1.2 million people in 1527, what I described represented for sure an enormous and tremendous effort, taking into account the resources available. This reality imposes that as far back as the reign of King John III, the Crown tried to limit the presence in North Africa, maintaining only the key points in the Far East, and shift the main effort to Brazil. However, Portugal will only abandon actual Morocco territories in 1769, when the city of Mazagan was evacuated, 354 years after the conquest of Ceuta. It was only during the Philippine Spanish dynasty that reigned in Portugal between 1580 and 1640 that almost all of the Far East was gone. Why? Well, because King Philip, the first of Portugal and the second of Spain, seized all the ships of most of the reformist powers, namely the Dutch and British, in the ports of the Iberian Peninsula in 1585 and in 1595. Therefore, those people unable to make their profitable commerce in the ports of Portugal and Spain decided to get the overseas production in its origin. In the result of this, Portugal, that until that time only have two enemies, the Castilians and the Muslim world, inherit all the enemies of Spain and was attacked by them everywhere. That speed up the decline in the Far East, make the Portuguese lose several places in Africa and presented a serious threat to Brazil. So in the next 4th century, we have to fight in 3 oceans and 4 continents continually, namely, during the so-called Dual Dynasty against the Dutch, the Acclamation War, the Spanish Succession War, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, in the World War I, and in the last overseas campaign between 1954 and 1975, with a lot of more in the middle. In sequences of the Napoleonic Wars took place the peculiar independence of Brazil, favored by our allied Great Britain, that expired to seize all the South American commerce, the doctrine of the American governments that went to expel all the European powers from the American continent, and by the action of the international Masonry lodges. With the loss of Brazil, the strategic effort went to Africa. This happened, however, very slowly, and was seriously affected by the severe political, economical, financial, and social crisis that ended in 2 civil wars in the first half of the 19th century. Only after the Berlin Conference in 1884, Portugal managed to do a real effort in Africa, which originates several military campaigns and the need to occupy the interior of the territory. During World War I, the Portuguese also had to fight in 4 fronts: Angola, Mozambique, the Atlantic, and the Flanders. In the end of the Second World War, in which Portugal managed to maintain neutrality by means of an extraordinary policy and strategy, which permit the safeguard of all of its territories, but East Timor, first occupied by the Dutch and the Australians, and after that by the Japanese, later recovered, the Portuguese territory was constitutionally composed by the following territories. In total, there were approximately 18 million people spread for 2 million square kilometers, separated by 3 oceans. The situation was perfectly stabilized, the borders settled and accorded. Portugal was not involved in any conflicts, besides the Cold War, since it was a founding member of NATO in 1949. Well, still exists a differendum with Spain related to the village of Olivenza since 1815. And I shall make now a brief introduction of the evolution of the international law related to the overseas territories. When the Portuguese first and later the Spaniards ventured into the discoveries, the international law was based on conquest and on the thesis of just war of St. Augustine. The supranational authority recognized as such in the Christian world was the Pope. In the beginning of the navigations, the Portuguese found territories that were inhabited or populated by tribes in a poor degree of civilization. Since the main objectives were to evangelize, to trade, and to fight the infidels, soon the navigations obtained the blessing of the Pope. When the Spanish competition was felt, beyond the fact that Portugal had developed the thesis of the Mare Clausum, which had the agreement of the Holy See, the Portuguese signed with the Castilian and Aragonese crowns the Treaty of Alcáçovas Toledo in 1479, and later, in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesilhas that divided the world in two hemispheres, one Portuguese and one Spanish. That definitely kept the Spaniards away of India. When the Portuguese finally arrived in the Ustanic Peninsula and spread throughout the Far East, they realized that the Muslim influence will not allow a peaceful settlement of the Portuguese presence. Therefore, war was inevitable. The Portuguese presence and action also represent an attack on the back of the Ottoman Empire, which rapidly spread throughout the Middle East, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Mediterranean, and North Africa after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. We should also notice that some of the Italian republics, notably Venice, helped the Sultan of Egypt against the presence of the Portuguese in India because they were afraid of losing the commerce of the products of the Orient. Until 1580, the Portuguese only had to face the assaults of corsairs, which was a common practice in those times. But after the union of the crown with Spain, the Portuguese had to deal with the hostility of other European powers. The first ones to went beyond the Cape of Good Hope after the Portuguese were the Dutch in 1595. This was, however, against the formula of the Mare Clausum that the Pope had imposed over Christianity. But now several countries, due to the Protestant reform initiated in 1517, don't obey to the Roman Church. And after the Dutch captured the Portuguese vessel near Malacca in 1603, the problem has raised a big discussion in the Low Countries. The question was studied by a notable jurist whose name was Hugus Grotius. From this study, a document was produced, the Jure Prade, from which the chapter 12 was individualized as a new thesis that became known as the Mare Liberum in 1609. This thesis states that the open sea should be free to be navigated by everyone, and that should be doctrine to be followed by all free princes and people of Christianity. The British, however, were against some parts of the Grotius study and published the Act of Navigation in 1651. This originated what became known as the Pact of Colonial System that was enforced until the 19th century. Basically, it intended to protect the exclusivity of commerce between each country and its overseas territories. But basically, after the division in Christianity and the centralization of royal power in the different states, the Holy See lost its power of intervention in the temporal events, so the resolution of conflicts rests only in diplomacy and canons. In the beginning of the 19th century, the problem of slavery and how to declare its traffic as illicit became paramount. It was very difficult to implement, and Portugal suffered in this domain a lot of unfair attacks besides the fact of its collaboration in this area and that it was the first country to abolish slavery in its European territory in 1761. And today, slavery is still practiced in the world. Throughout the 19th century, there was a race in Europe to occupy overseas territories, mainly in Africa. This race culminated in the Berlin Conference in 1884. This conference imposes that for a country had the right to be in a territory, it has to occupy it effectively and has the obligation to civilize and develop the indigenous people the so-called burden of the white man. After this, the Portuguese had some serious problems: indigenous revolts, conflicts with other powers, secret agreements against them in 1898, 1913, and 1938, and even an ultimatum in 1890. While this happened, all the Central and South America got independent, just to fall in a neo-colonial domain by the USA, which culminated in the Spanish-American War of 1898. After World War I, we have also to face the system of the mandates invented by the Society of Nations and the regime of open door and the double mandate before World War II. Finally, during this war, in 1941, in a place in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean kept secret until today, it was signed the Charter of the Atlantic between Churchill and Roosevelt that contained the principles of the United Nations Charter, signed by the representatives of 50 countries in San Francisco in June 1945. Portugal didn't participate in the debates and did not sign the Charter. After the end of the Second World War, the so-called Cold War started, and the different armies stand along the Iron Curtain. On the west, NATO was created in 1949, and the east side, the Warsaw Pact, was established in 1955. The emergency of the atomic weapon arouses a strategic equilibrium by terror of mutual destruction, later followed by the detente policy. Therefore, the armies of main powers can't fight directly with each other. So the self-determination concept appeared as a means of an indirect strategy. We can define it as the right of a people to its sovereignty and to decide independently about the form of government and the model of its social, cultural, and economic development. So it was not anything new. To help in this concept, the meaning of the term colonization, which stands for the overall relationship between two peoples in which one is more developed than the other, which, by the way, came from the Latin and means cultivate, foster, valorize, bring forth, improve, etc., was deliberately misled by confusing with the term colonialism, which is an expression of exploration of men by other men. All of this was put in action in the Bandung Conference in 1955, the Accra Conference in 1958, and the Addis Ababa Conference in 1960. In Bandung was born the ideas of the Third World, non-alignment with the superpowers, and the North-South conflict. And three leaders emerged: Nasser from Egypt, Tito from Yugoslavia, and Sukarno from Indonesia. Nevertheless, the result of most of the following events concurred objectively in the interest of the Soviet bloc, and it was an indirect way to fight the Cold War. All of this was extended to Central and South America. As a matter of fact, the colonization didn't have in mind the self-government of the peoples or their well-being, but the replacements of sovereignty. It was aimed also for the strengthening of power through the control of raw materials and points of strategical importance. And forms of neo-colonialism were installed everywhere. So the independence granted to the majority of countries were just of virtual nature, like in the same way that most of the actual currency doesn't have any correlation with the real value of economy. It looks like that the famous history winds, initial winds of change, phrase took out of a speech of the British Prime Minister Macmillan in South Africa in 1960, existed since a long time ago and are always whispered by whom detain power in each age. So I hope these international historic committees help to change this sentence of Napoleon. In brief, we can say that the Portuguese expansion reached its peak in the middle of the 16th century, was motivated for geopolitical and strategic reasons that included the religious fervor and commerce. This expansion represented a national cause that endured for 600 years and had an end in 1999 with the integration of Macau in the Popular Republic of China. Until the beginning of the Philippine dual crown in 1580, that expansion was ensured by the Portuguese technological advance in the fields of the armament, namely artillery, fortification, naval construction, astronomy, navigation, and the knowledge of winds and sea currents. With the reign of the dynasty of the Habsburg in Madrid, the Portuguese lost the ability to have its own diplomacy and gain all the enemies of Spain by the simple fact that Philip, as King of Spain, cannot be at war, and as King of Portugal could take advantage of peace. And if the Portuguese until the end of the 16th century only had in the Far East the Muslim forces as its enemies, after 1595 they also have as hostiles in sequence the Dutch, the French, and the British. So we can devise three big scenarios of strategic orientation. During the War of Restoration, also called Acclamation, during 1640-1668, the Portuguese lost most of the territories in India and the Far East. It was, let's say, the price Portugal had to pay not to be integrated in Spain. After these events, the strategic effort was reoriented to Brazil, territory where, meanwhile, a lot of mineral wealth has been discovered. After the French invasions and the strategic retreat of the Portuguese royal family and government to the Rio de Janeiro in 1807, Brazil made its way to independence, which was declared in 1822. That represented the price Portugal had to pay to get rid of the French and to generate a new strategic orientation, this time to Africa. Finally, the new ideas of self-determination and anti-colonialism that emerged after World War II that had the objective of expulsion of European political presence in Asia and in Africa, in a similar way of what happened in the American continent after the beginning of the 19th century, was responsible for a lot of wars of independence in the majority of the territories colonized by European nations. Portugal was the last one to step out. That was the price the Portuguese nation had to pay in order to enter the European Economic Community and in what is called democracy. What happened since then will be certainly object of future congresses within 1 or 2 decades. Thank you very much, and shalom.
Thank you very much for this interesting paper with such a wide scope. It were 2 papers: the history of colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, and an attempt to sketch the evolution of the concept of self-determination. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now time for questions, but the logistical positions are a little bit difficult. What I suggest is that the 3 speakers, the 2 of them will sit down here and the other will stay over there for some, and I will sit down so that everyone can bring forward the questions. Is that okay for you? Because, if you have a question, Professor De Leonardis wants to start. There is over there a microphone, I see. Gentlemen, would you please sit down over here?
Well, of course, all the 3 papers were very interesting. I would just to make a few comments on the second paper, because it happens that for a conference which will be held in Athens next month, I had to read and study this multi-domain document produced by the Americans, which are always very much fertile with these documents. In my opinion, this document has some limits. It's a fairly long document, 84 pages. in which is never mentioned any past experience. So it appears that all lessons learned are not there, and we as historians are not, we are not important. Of course, there is the other extreme, that is the famous quip by Winston Churchill, who once said, well, there is an old saying that the War Office is always preparing the last war. Yes, of course, you have to look forward, but, to forget completely the second comment is, as you mentioned, that this document refers to military campaigns against peer adversaries in the 2025-2040 time frame. Well, first of all, 6 years, 7 years is a long period in history, so what will happen in 2000, we don't know. The document is clearly aimed, it talks of peer adversaries, is clearly aimed to a conflict with Russia, and to a much lesser extent with China. If you look to the document, Russia is mentioned 12 times, and China is mentioned 3 times. Terrorism is just mentioned once, and guerrilla is mentioned twice. Islam is never mentioned. The CIMIC, the civil-military cooperation, which is a fundamental element in the stabilization process of current real conflicts, never appears. So certainly this document is a good exercise. I wonder how much it is useful for the more likely conflict of the near future. Just a comment, not a specific question.
Well, but I can answer. First of all, I think you're talking about one document. You're talking about 2.0, the multi-domain battle issued by the United States Army. As I told you, I think I told here, today the concept is called multi-domain operations and strategy, so it has evolved, it's now joint. And it is a political approach, it's not longer US Army only, or US Marines only. And it was taken by NATO. Now it's called the Framework for Operations 2018. It was published in May. So the multi-domain concept, operations and strategy, is now a NATO concept. It's not only US. And it evolves, it goes back to history. It goes to Thucydides, by the way, when it talks about multi-domain operations and strategy, and it introduces the way interagency operations. And I am not a CIMIC fan, by the way. So that's why I talk about holistic operations, and I would never talk about CIMIC, because CIMIC is a little bit paternalistic. It's how military want to integrate the civilian part. And the holistic way is when you put side by side civilian, economic, diplomatic, and military ways of approach. So I'm not defending the multi-domain battle. It was a concept. It was developed in 2017. It has evolved. And as I think I told here, it was changed in the summer for these multi-domain operations and strategy. And right now that NATO has adopted it in the NATO Framework Operations 2018, I think it's a good concept to learn, and it has a lot of history, by the way. And it's not for near-peer competition only. It's written there, it's also for guerrilla warfare and for hybrid, especially for hybrid wars. So it's a concept very well developed for hybrid wars. But again, I'm not defending multi-domain. I'm just saying that multi-domain battle... I know. I'm not defending multi-domain because, of course, it was born American, now it's a little bit more NATO. But anyway, the idea of having all the instruments of power, economic, diplomatic, military, aligned in a way that you sense that each domain is equal to the other, that's the big difference. So to realize that you can be chief of the cyber command and you can be chief of the army, you have 4 stars, both of them have 4 stars. It's just an image that I want to show. It's trying to look at the same time you are using the 5 domains and the 2 dimensions and the instruments of power aligned to get a result that is political. I think that's the novelty that we have to envelop in this new world that is going to come, because we really need to do at the same time cyber, space, air, land, and of course electromagnetic spectrum and cognitive domain. That's hybrid wars is that, yes.
I actually have a request. I hope that you will take it for Enrico Mariani. Would you show the maps and spend a minute on each map and explain the situation and the year that it reflects?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Okay. It's coming? Okay. I'd like to stop on them one by one. Okay, this is just a picture that shows from Getty Image Archive, shows the French, British, and Italian generals in one of the building of Constantinople. Try to show facade unity. Even the Italian general is present, as a matter of fact, it was just a kind of political ghost, because Italy, despite participated also in the front in Salonika, was always considered always marginal, this for their own interest. Because also the participation of the troops was a political decision against the military leadership, because General Cadorna at maximum want to have troops in Albania. And this Italian force in Salonika even was a level of army corps was kept at division level. So the policy-making level of the Italian commander was lower to their or other peers. These are because was mentioned often mentioned in the previous speech, the partition of the League of Nations over the Turkish occupied territory, split between France and Britain. You see, Palestine at time included also Transjordan. This is 1920. 1920. All of these were considered mandate type A, so that will be, in theory, permitted to access to independence in the earliest time. This is another example of what I mentioned, the partition of the zone of influence according to the Treaty of Sevres. As you see, the Greek area signed to Greece, the zone of influence of France and Italy, and the neutralized zone garrisoned by forces of France, Britain, and Italy. And also the establishment of this new territory that is so-called, the blue one is the Armenia, the Wilsonian Armenia, and as well the uncertain future and fate of the Kurdistan that remain as of today a serious problem between powers. This is the Treaty of Lausanne that followed the Treaty of Sevres that will reestablish the national unity and the integrity of Turkey with some changes. So you see the area of Iskenderun that still till now is claimed by Syria, and there was an agreement with the establishment of a multinational force between France and Turkey, and the provisional area of the multinational control of the straits by the international community. And this is the Sykes-Picot partition plan between France and Britain. As you see, I think that Mr. Picot passed away from the Spanish influenza after that. I don't know. And this is just a short line to show how was the international offensive against Russia by France and Britain in 1919-20. This is the position of the anti-Bolshevik forces. And these are the General Milne, the commander-in-chief of British forces in the Middle East, and Marshal Franchet d'Espéry. Franchet d'Espéry, called by Turkish nationalists. Again, that's it. Thank you.
My question is for Colonel Ferreira. It's a pity I can't speak in Portuguese, will be more clear. But in your exposition, when you put all the plan of all the descobertas, you put the 4 trips of Colón in America. Of course, these trips are from the Castilla Corona, no? But in 1530, you put in Uruguay, but El Río, the Silver River was from 1515 Solís, and after Magallanes, a Portuguese, made an exploration of the river in 1520. That is, but my question is not related with this. You said Portugal has an heritage of all the enemies of Spain. Portugal, in heritage, take all the enemies of Spain. That is not an holistic point of view. It's very, because Prior de Crato is going to France. France helped and sent a big fleet to the Terceira. It's not an enemy, it's an ally in the beginning. The traditional alliance of Portugal with England and after with the United Kingdom is 500 or 600 years old. Then it's a statement a little concentrate in enemies, but there are, for example, in 1625, we made the recuperation of Bahia to the Netherlands. Well, can you explain this?
Thank you. Well, we need to stay here until midnight to discuss all of these things. But as you can see, I try to make a broad approach. It takes 600 years, so in 20 minutes it's not easy. Okay, the trips of Colón, I think it was in red. I should have explained it, but I explained now. They are there just to make a comparison. Yes, we do the same when they, okay? I'm not going to enter in the big arguments that with nationality of Colón, or to whom it works or all that stuff, because it will be, we need a Congress on that, but it's just to make a comparison of what was going on between the two countries, and also to illustrate the 2 treaties of Alcáçovas and Tordesilhas. Then I don't think if I quite understand the problem of Uruguay. I was talking about the city of Sacramento, and as you know, Sacramento moves hands between Portugal and Spain during 7 times. Okay, I just put it there. It was the last one, well, not the last one, but one of the last places where we went. That's only a chronology figure. And I also know that you help us to get rid of the Dutch in Brazil in 1621, but I think that only 25, but I think it was the only time that the rest of the peninsula helped us in our fighting. Of course, a lot of, there has to be also to understand, we need to understand a duality here. Most of the countries in Europe have 2 types of politics against us. One related to the territory in Europe, and the other one that a lot of times does nothing to do what they really do overseas. So for a lot of times we have been in peace in Europe with, let's say, with the Dutch or with the French, and even with the British, and they will be in war in overseas. So this reality you have also to understand. And it's okay? Or it's...
The problem was that the administration of territories was separated. The kingdom was unified.
Yeah, I know.
But the administration was
That's why I only talk on diplomacy, okay? Because that's what we really Portuguese lost was diplomacy, not the rest.
Ladies and gentlemen, with this final question, I would like to close this session, but not before an extra applause for the three speakers. Thank you very much.